overcriminalization of sex trade survivors, many of whom are women and youth of color, but also reveals how these buyers, who are mostly men, enjoy impunity and anonymity for what are often extreme acts of violence, even when committed against children. At a time when the identities of those on Jeffrey Epstein's client list and the participants on Sean Combs' freak-offs remain a mystery, our report provides critical insight into this often overlooked dimension of commercial sexual exploitation and the characteristics of those who purchase sexual acts. Importantly, the report incorporates real quotes from sex buyers from all across the United States, illustrating how these men think, view, and discuss the individuals they purchase for sexual gratification. It's also no coincidence that this conversation today is happening against the backdrop of the 10-year anniversary of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, a landmark federal law that emphasized the importance of confronting the demand for commercial sex as a means of primary prevention for sex trafficking. So as we mark the many achievements of this law, including the tens of millions raised for victim services, the parity it's created in emphasizing the need to go after not just the traffickers, but also the sex buyers, and the hugely impactful U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking that it established, we aim to highlight several innovative programs and models around the country, emphasizing the ways that we can deter demand, change buyer mindsets, while also raising critical funds for survivor services, another key hallmark of the JVTA. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's discussion, Nora Hennick. Nora is the Communications Director for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and our co-author on Buyers from Unmasked. So please join me in welcoming Nora Hennick. Thank
you, Yasmin, and thank you all for joining us today for this important discussion. As Yasmin mentioned, I am the Communications Director for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. We are one of the oldest international organizations working to end the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls. And I'd like to introduce our fine panelists today. Yasmin Bafa, as you all have met her already. And then we have Dr. Stephanie Powell, a retired law enforcement sergeant in charge at the LAPD, and also a former direct service provider at Journey Out LA. And next to her, we have Melanie Thompson, a survivor of sex trafficking and prostitution, and a speaker, activist, and my colleague at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women as our Chief Outreach and Advocacy Officer. And then we have Peter Qualentine, an anti-violence advocate and co-founder of the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, OPS, in Seattle, Washington. And then we have Nate Walsh, Assistant District Attorney from Androscoggin County in Maine. Thank you all for being here today. So I thought we would start with you, Yasmin. You briefly mentioned the scope of the work of Rights for Girls in terms of what they've done for justice reform and advocating for the rights of marginalized and vulnerable girls. So how would you say that the conclusions of our report of Buyers Unmasked, how does it fit into this larger conversation around justice reform and survivor-led policies?
Well, our report really arose out of, as I mentioned, numerous conversations that we've had with survivor leaders all across the country, both child sex trafficking survivors as well as adult sex trade survivors of prostitution as well as sexual exploitation, who had been criminalized for their experiences in the sex trade. And of course, hopefully you were able to grab some of the fact sheets outside that show the overwhelming disparities between who is bought and sold in the commercial sex trade, whether we're talking about children or adults. We're talking about overwhelmingly women and youth of color, and who is overwhelmingly purchasing them. Across the country, we can see that it's predominantly men of means, and oftentimes white men of means. And you can see that it's women and girls of color who bear the brunt of prostitution arrests all across the country. And so we really wanted to raise up not only these acute inequalities, but also highlight the mindsets of the individuals who are fueling the sex trade. Because as many survivors will tell you, if there were no buyers, there would be no business. And, many of us have advocated for many years about the harmful role of sex buyers. We have the data that, people in the sex trade have, a mortality rate that's 200 times that of the general population. We have the data that shows that, women in the sex trade suffer extreme violence. 92% of them have been burned, shot, beaten, strangled, and other types of very egregious forms of violence. But nothing was as powerful as sharing these quotes from buyers in their own words. And so we were actually very inspired by the work of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and a report that they did on sex buyers in New York called From Impunity to Accountability. And what we wanted to do was take these quotes and lift them up from various cities all across the United States. And what we did in this report was feature them regionally. So West Coast, Southern United States, Midwest, and Northeast, and really just showcase these individuals and the ways in which they dehumanize, objectify, fetishize these individuals that they're purchasing for sexual gratification, and show that they really have very little regard for these individuals, and that ultimately these individuals are aware and largely indifferent to overt signs of violence, trafficking, coercion, severe desperation like substance abuse in the people that they're purchasing for sex. And so as a result, we drew several conclusions based on those trends that we saw, that we lifted up in the report, and conclude that they have to be held accountable. We'll talk a little bit about what accountability can look like. Of course, we can't, arrest, and we're not promoting, the imprisonment of every single sex buyer, but there has to be a form of accountability whereby we are deterring this action because the harms are profound. And one of the other things that we do in this report is we highlight and juxtapose the words of these sex buyers with quotes from survivors that highlight their experiences at the hands of buyers. Because as we know, we often think about the harms that traffickers subject, their victims to, but we don't think about the violence that individuals experience at the hands of sex buyers. And so what we've been doing and what we hope the report can help to effectuate is survivor sentencing reform and survivor centered justice reform at the state and federal level. And there's a number of bills that are pending now all across the states that essentially reflect this type of advocacy that we're really proud to be a part of. Again, all of it is survivor-led, and we have a number of people on this panel that can talk about some of those efforts, but it really does tie in to the advocacy around, justice reform and accountability, but also making sure that everything is really led and inspired by survivor voices and advocacy.
And kind of building off of that, the accountability piece and the frameworks that the report recommends, how would you say the report connects to the policy initiatives laid out by the JVTA?
Well, the JVTA was monumental in the fact that it really made clear that demand reduction is a form of violence prevention and trafficking prevention. And it made it clear, not just at the federal level, but it also made clear that federal law enforcement has to work to help scale up the investigative capabilities of state and local law enforcement to go after sex buyers as well through all of the anti-trafficking task forces. And it signaled an important, a very important federal guidance by clarifying the law and the legislative intent that, the TVPA and the criminal statutes don't just signal the importance of going after traffickers, but we have to also go after sex buyers. And so the language of the JVTA clarified 1591 that, added the words patronizes and solicits to the crime to make clear that we're not just looking at traffickers here. And again, that parity is very important because we know that these individuals are just as culpable for the harms that they cause survivors. And again, a lot of that was survivor-led based on their testimonies, based on, their personal experiences. And so it's very similar, and a lot of that advocacy also in terms of seeking to hold buyers accountable and fining them in order to help, promote a form of restitution and finance victim services is another key hallmark of JVTA that has inspired state-led advocacy in terms of finding buyers to help finance victim services. And that's something we're seeing in numerous states like Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Illinois, and several other jurisdictions like New Jersey and elsewhere that are highlighting this type of approach.
So I'm going to move on to Melanie. Melanie, as you know, a large part of the report includes quotes taken directly from these online hobby boards and also some text conversations from prospective sex buyers and a decoy person. And they're all very graphic and difficult to read. I don't know how many people have had a chance to read the report, but I'm just gonna read a few of the more G-rated posts that are in the report. Quote, I saw her up until she was homeless, wore that black and pink bikini for weeks on end. I still would pay for her Uber to my house and fuck her unshaved, unkempt, unshowered, and wearing that smelly bikini. I'll do it again and again if given a chance. And another buyer says, quote, she is an object that's placed there by society for men like us to use and move on with life. So, Melanie, why do you think it's important for people to hear this language? And from your perspective as a sex trade survivor, what do you want people to know about sex buyers?
Great question. So, first off, I think people need to hear it just as raw as we heard it now. And if this is G-rated, then I know, but I'm sure folks can imagine what R-rated looks like for buyers. And I want people to hear it this raw because although it's uncomfortable or perhaps uncomfortable for folks in the room, prostitution and sex trafficking is uncomfortable in reality. And I think oftentimes when there are conversations that are held around this issue, we tend to sugarcoat what it actually looks like. There are not enough survivor voices in the room, unfortunately, to be able to validate what the reality truly looks like on the street. And when we are present, we are often trying to talk about this issue in a way that is easy to digest for folks who have never gone through that. But unfortunately, what that does, it kind of minimizes what the harsh reality and the inherent harms look like. Unfortunately, when we talk about this issue, we think of, certain movies, or we think of extreme cases where there's kidnapping overseas, or light cases like Pretty Woman or things of that nature, but we never actually talk about what the beatings look like, what, the medical and physical side effects of sex trafficking actually looks like on the body, what this does to the inside of people. So I think just hearing this is in the way that they say it is very important for us to actually understand how harmful this system is. And when it comes to buyers specifically, I think it's super important that we highlight them. I feel like I'm so loud. I think it's super important that we highlight them because, as Yasmin mentioned in her opening remarks, they're often left out of the conversation. When we do talk about this particular topic and this issue, we tend to focus on either myself, predominantly women who were trafficked or involved in prostitution, or we talk about the sex trafficker, and rightfully so. They tend to be violent. A lot of them tend to be violent or coercive, and at very base minimum exploitative. So it is great that we're talking about that. However, the buyers are left out of the conversation for many reasons, and I can go down the list. But I want people to know that there's no such thing as a good buyer. And I say this because when we talk about sex buyers or people who purchase sexual access to folks, we tend to, as a society and culturally, make excuses for them. We tend to say things like, oh, well, he was just ugly and he can't get it any other way. Or, oh, what about if he's disabled and in a wheelchair and nobody wants to have sex with him? Or, oh, he's unhappy at home with his wife. So we continue, and there's plenty more, and I can go down the list later. But we as a society and culturally tend to make excuses for the sex buyers. I want folks to also note that sex buyers, in my personal opinion, are actually more harmful in most cases than the traffickers themselves. Yes, sex traffickers can be physically abusive, can kidnap or abduct, can, in my case, burn you, beat you, things of that nature. And that in itself is inherently harmful. What makes sex buyers particularly unique in this scenario is that although traffickers are physically violent, I don't know the percentage, but the majority of traffickers tend to engage and sell people because they themselves are also lacking resources or come from the same communities in which we are trafficked. So usually out of quote unquote necessity in their minds, right? Or they're gang related or so on and so forth. It's something in their early childhood that exposed them to thinking that this was a good choice to make money, right? With sex buyers, on the other hand, their sense of entitlement is what led them to purchase sexual access to somebody. And as Nora mentioned, we know statistically that demographic is majority middle-aged white men with disposable income that usually are purchasing the majority of us disproportionately. We're disproportionately represented, Black and brown women and girls, and LGBTQ plus identifying folks, right? So what that means is that these middle-aged white men with disposable income are knowingly taking advantage of folks who are disenfranchised and not of the same status and need resources. So I like to tell people that prostitution, sex trafficking, this is not necessarily about sex. This is about power and control. And sex buyers know all too well that if you purchase somebody like me who comes from a marginalized community, I 9 times out of 10 don't have any other options. In my personal case, I grew up in foster care. So for that, that's an added incentive for sex buyers to take advantage, knowing that there's a lack of family that's going to be coming to look for me, correct? So I want folks to understand that sex buyers are not innocent in this equation, that they're actually smarter than we think, that we need to stop making excuses for them, and that their harm can sometimes overpower the harm of traffickers.
Thank you. I want to move on to Peter. So you're meeting these men at a different point than Melanie's talking about. So this is after they've been apprehended for buying sex. Could you talk a little bit about your approach to engaging with these men? The report itself talks about your program, Stopping Sexual Exploitation at OPS, where participants reported having significant shifts in their thinking about women in general and about the system of prostitution after completing the program. So how did you get men there mentally? And what role do you think buyer accountability programs play in this broader fight against sexual exploitation?
First of all, I'd like to just recognize that the sex buyers are not a homogenous population, that there's a lot of differences. But I think the unifying factor, something Mel mentioned, is that they feel entitled to transactional sex, right? And we see a whole range of behaviors, all of which are entitled to transactional sex of one kind or another, from lowest levels of abuse and inequality up until the worst forms of sexual violence that you can think of. Where I come in from in Seattle, we had somebody, a man named Gary Ridgway, who's known as the Green River Killer. And who did the Green River Killer target? Right, and he killed more than 49. We think it's over 90. And he said he would kill. He thought he would kill as many as he wanted without being caught. And it took 20 years to catch him. And why did it take 20 years to catch him? Would it have taken 20 years to catch somebody if they were picking up women at the university or on lunch downtown? It was specifically because they were prostituted. It was specifically because they were seen as, quote, prostitutes, that they were targeted with this form of exploitation. And it makes sense. Like if you're thinking about, Gary Ridgway, he said, I could kill as many as I wanted without getting caught. So he targeted a class of folks who's been seen as disposable and who's been there for men's use and pleasure. So that's one end of the continuum. And you brought up the idea of a good John. And I've got a good John story. I have, at my class in Seattle, sometimes men self-refer to the class. Now and then I'll get a referral. One time I got a referral, a whole set of referrals, because I had a man in class who came through an arrest who at one point said, my therapist doesn't think that sex buying is a problem. He doesn't think I should have gotten arrested. And so I said, well, what's your therapist's number? And can I call him? And so I called him and I talked to him for a long time. And then it ended up becoming a CEU training that we developed for therapists so that they could help the men self-refer to the class if they noticed sex-buying behavior amongst their clientele. But anyway, this guy called to self-refer to the class. And I met him for coffee, as one does in Seattle. And we sat down at the table and he said, "Peter, thank you so much for meeting with me. I just want you to know I'm a good John. I never hurt the girls. I never hurt the girls physically, and I never hurt the girls emotionally." And then he stopped himself. And he said, "Well, you know, I don't know if I really can say I've never hurt them emotionally or not, because when you look in their eyes, it's like they're wearing a mask." And so I asked him, you know, what part of this other person being dissociative told you that it was a great time to go ahead and have sex with them? Would you have done that with the woman who was not in prostitution? And he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, because I paid. And that's a good job. Entitled to transactional sex. And so the efficacy, I think, of the work that we do with the program, insofar as it is effective, and I think it's somewhat effective in changing individual behavior of the men that come to the class. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But I think that the effectiveness that we do have is that first we recognize that sex buyers experience a lot of ambivalence about their behaviors, and I know it sounds counterintuitive, but they do. Over 60% of men who buy sex say that they want to stop. So what we do is we do a set of motivational enhancement sessions with them before they come into the group class, one-on-one sessions with them, to really draw them into taking a look at their behavior and taking a look at the consequences of the behavior in their lives and in the lives of the people that they've exploited. And it's you know, throughout the 8 weeks of the class, then we take them on a journey to kind of reframe the issue of commercial sexual exploitation and prostitution and see the people who are exploited as people, right? And to reframe the abuse and not see it as a victimless crime anymore, but it's a system of men's violence against other people, predominantly women, children, trans folks, gay and lesbian folks. We then interrogate the roots of male supremacy, the ideology that this comes from, and then are able to take a look at the culture that they've grown up in and what they've learned about sex and sexuality. You know, I think I was talking to somebody earlier, the culture teaches boys and men that we can get our relational needs met through non-relational sex. But you can't get there from here. And so what we seek to do is to look at this reality of this bifurcation between these ideas about sex and sexuality that are transactional in nature and those that are mutual in nature. And then we interrogate that with the buyers and talk about the meaning of sex buying as an abuse of power and as existing on a continuum of sexual assault. And then we talk about mutuality and about the courage it takes to actually risk rejection from someone. The courage it takes to actually risk intimacy with someone. The courage it takes to actually engage with someone as a full human being with rights not unlike your own. The tragedy, though, is that we put on a good year maybe 200 men through the sex buyers class in the city of Seattle. 10 years ago, Arizona State University took a look at sex buyers in Seattle, and in a 24-hour period in King County, where Seattle is, they found over estimated 6,000 sex buyers trying to contact them. 200 a year versus 6,000 in a 24-hour period. So it's going to take a lot more than after the fact. It's going to take work along a spectrum of prevention. We've got to get upstream. We've got to be talking to boys, young men. We've got to be talking to parents. We've got to be talking about these hegemonic modes of masculinity that get transmitted generation after generation after generation that underlie not just commercial sexual exploitation, but domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, we need to connect the dots between these different forms of men's violence against others. And we need to see the crucial piece that these are all about ownership and transaction and power imbalances. And we need to move towards mutuality, away from power over others and towards power with others. Right? Recognize that when you talk to the king will answer, as my grandmother used to say. And in the sex buyers class, that's where we come from. We treat them with the respect and dignity that we want them to treat other people. And we invite them into accountability, and we invite them into beloved community, and hope that they have the courage to be there and build it. And so it's part of a much broader picture. It's a broader culture change picture, right? That the actual sex buyer, needs our attention certainly, but it needs to be a coordinated response that's dealing with the spectrum of prevention and between multiple levels of social ecology. The same thing we've learned about domestic violence and sexual assault. We need to take those things and the things we've learned about culture change, the things we've learned about men's entitlement, and apply them to commercial sexual exploitation. And not miss out on understanding the harm because we're just looking at a third-party trafficker. Sex buying itself is an abuse of power. It exists on a continuum of sexual assault. It's transactional, like quid pro quo, literally. And a sexual harassment creates inequality in the workplace. Prostitution creates inequality in the world. Thanks.
Now I want to move on to Dr. Powell, kind of get into the law enforcement aspect. Though you do have the unique perspective of having worked both in law enforcement and in direct service, providing direct services for survivors of trafficking and prostitution. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Powell, in your experience working with the LAPD, what were some of the obstacles you faced in holding sex buyers accountable?
First of all, it's kind of a hard act to follow. Let me just start with that. But, hearing that word, right, transactional sex, when you hear that, it doesn't sound like we're talking about human beings. And so just letting those words sit with you for a moment, it just seems to be so unreal, but it goes back to the culture and the lack of strong laws. So what are the obstacles? For a police officer, it is strong laws. It is probable cause. And then when we look at the culture, we're also thinking about how the marginalized, how it's not important enough to have these strong laws, right? So I worked a lot in South Central LA and in the San Fernando Valley. So all of us know about Figueroa, which is one of the most notorious tracks. And yes, I worked as a sergeant in charge of a vice unit. And then from there, I became an advocate for victims of human trafficking. So I know it from both ends. And so working in South Central LA, I'll never forget, officers brought in a buyer, and they brought in this 12-year-old girl who she really did look to be she looked older, right? And so I knew what was going to happen to the buyer. The buyer was going to get a ticket and be out the door. And then the young lady was going to go to the Department of Children's Services. And so I said, well, what about the accountability? This guy is buying a 12-year-old girl. And the officer was also dismayed because they were like, but there's no laws. What the best I can do is get him for solicitation. Think about that. The best you could do was get him for solicitation. Why? Because there were no other laws that were going to actually put him in jail. And so a lot of times, I know myself, I have arrested a lot of buyers, and the majority of them were adult men. I've arrested everything from the gardener to the surgeon, to the police officer, went to the firemen. So everything that they're saying about who they are, I made those arrests. But what I'm going to tell you is they were probably home before I finished my shift. So there's no real accountabilities, and studies have shown that because there are no consequences, that's why you have the repeat offenders. It's just like what Peter was saying. And so it's because of those reasons, coupled with society that says all of those excuses of why they're out there, so we really feel sorry for them, so they really don't mean it. Yeah, they do mean it. And I don't know about you guys, but I know I've watched a lot of ID, and it goes back to what you were saying, that the serial killers will say, I picked them because nobody would be looking for them. You know, when you, as a police officer and talking to a young lady, because back in the day, we made a lot of those arrests, and thank God we've come full circle on that. But in talking to her, she just happened to say that she was raped by a buyer. And I'm like, wait, I need to do a rape report. And she said, no, don't worry about it. She said, it's like being a fireman, sometimes you get burned. She said, because when I've reported before, nothing has happened. So when you feel like, you know, nothing is going to happen to you because you've gotten raped, or when I had officers that would say, well, it wasn't actually a rape, it was just a bad business transaction. Hey, well, what? Let me tell you, those were the guys who did not work in my particular unit. I'm just telling you right now, because I would make sure that I picked people that had more of a victim-centered approach. So those are the reasons, and those are the obstacles, and that's why we need the lawmakers, we need legislation, we need to be able to have the tools to make those arrests, but it also needs to be coupled with training, victimology training for law enforcement officers. Along with that, it also needs the collaboration of nonprofit organizations working alongside with law enforcement, working alongside survivors and victims of human trafficking. So those are the obstacles, those are the things that are needed.
Perfect. I think that's a great transition to move to Nate. So you were instrumental in authoring Maine's groundbreaking law, which decriminalized people selling sex while maintaining the penalties against those who buy sex. So could you talk a little bit about the specific elements of this legal framework known as the survivor model and the path forward for other states to enact similar legislation?
Sure. So it's the survivor model, the equality model, the Nordic model. Basically, what it boils down to is it's partial decriminalization. It's where the act of selling sex isn't criminalized, but buying sex, trafficking, pimping, brothel keeping, all still illegal. It's something that was started over in Sweden about 20 years ago, and they've been doing it successfully. And it's great hearing Dr. Powell talk about law enforcement work with cops every day. And then you talk to the cops in Sweden, and they're like, yeah, well, our younger officers have just grown up in this society, so this is normal for us. So they're not having those same discussions and same issues that I'm having, where we're trying to overcome just like, years and years of doing things the same way. But so I am from Maine. Well, I live there. I was born and raised in Massachusetts, but don't hold it against me. But I've come to see this issue as the commercial sexual exploitation of some of the most vulnerable members of our community. In Maine, that means substance use disorder, it means poverty, it means geographic isolation. Maine as a state is very old and it's very white. So people don't, there's kind of a thinking in Maine that, we don't have this issue here, which is something I've done human trafficking work for the last 10 years in the city of Portland and then currently in the city of Lewiston. And I'll tell you, it was eye-opening to me when I started doing the work, because you think Maine, it's all lighthouses and lobster rolls. But we do have an issue with trafficking, just like everywhere else in the country, everywhere with access to the internet. So Maine, when I started doing this work, was a full criminalization state. So we had a vice unit that would go out and they would do drugs and prostitution. And when I say they would do prostitution, it means that local businesses would complain about the track. Or city leaders would complain about the track, and the cops would say, okay, we're going to go out and clear the corners. They're going to go out, they're going to arrest the girls, make the easiest pinch in the world, and give them another criminal charge. but then the corners are clear for, a few days, potentially. And there would be some demand stings for the Johns, and then there would also be trafficking investigations. But trafficking investigations were arresting the girls and saying, "Are you being trafficked?" No? Okay. Or, calling up a Backpage ad, showing up in uniform into a hotel room while they're in lingerie on the bed and then saying, "Are you being trafficked?" And then, no. Okay. And to highlight that, so I did have a case come in where there was a young woman from the New York area, and her trafficker were in a hotel room in Maine. The girl was arrested, the trafficker was let go because the arresting officers thought that they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. And then she came in for an interview after that, identified him as her trafficker, and said that he had sent her a photo of 2 members of his gang at her mother's house. And so that was kind of the fear that she was experiencing. And it was incredibly brave for her to even come forward in the first place. But she could have easily just pled to a prostitution charge, and then took a criminal conviction, because I can't promise her safety. I can't, if she doesn't feel like she wants to cooperate under that mechanism, that was it. She just took a criminal charge. So, my very close friend was working in the vice unit, and he had gone out and done these operations where they were arresting the girls, and he had arrested the same girl 2 times. In different stings. She didn't remember him, that he was an officer who had previously arrested her. And then one night, him and his partner were in an unmarked unit, and a call came in for a woman screaming in the street, possibly a domestic. Patrol was going to go pick it up, but they said, "We're closer, let's just go." So they went and they rolled up on, they found the woman that he had arrested twice before, and she had tried to rob a John, and he chased her out of the car and stomped on her head in the street, and picked her body up, thinking she might have been dead, and dumped it in an alleyway. And they rolled up just as he was exiting the alleyway, got to a foot chase, arrested him. And he and I talked, and he said, I'm not helping. I wasn't helping her those times that I arrested her. We have to do something different. And so that's where, those kind of kitchen table conversations we were having, we were talking about the Nordic model, and we went to our friend in the legislature, late Representative Lois Gallagher-Reckitt, who had been involved in the National Organization for Women and the Human Rights Fund, had run the local domestic violence shelter for decades. And she took this up and started this legislation, and it took years, and it took a lot of work to get the equality model passed. In fact, we got it through the legislature in one period, and then the governor vetoed it because she was having trouble, and also she didn't want to be the first in the country to enact this legislation. But we brought it back again, but this time it was really the work of survivors and the survivor voices that were the most heard and listened to. There a lot of survivors that showed up in Maine who helped helped us really drive the point home that got it passed. Now law enforcement focuses the criminal sanction where it's more appropriate, which is the people who are actually responsible for the harm being perpetrated, which is the sex buyers, the traffickers, the pimps, the brothel keepers. So, now we're doing demand operations. And I can tell you in January, in the town of Wilton, Maine, I don't know if any of you have been to the Blueberry Festival, but it's a population of about 3,800 people. We did a John sting, and we arrested 3 people in a day. As they've said, the demand cannot be overstated. The phones blow up, even in rural parts of Maine. So if people wouldn't buy people, people wouldn't sell people. The buyers are the root cause of the issue. It's that money and the transactional nature of it that are responsible for all the traffic. A lot of the attention is drawn to trafficking, but you really need to focus on the buying. And so and also doing this work, I should also say that have I met people who self-identify as sex workers and say I'm experiencing prostitution on my own terms, and this is something that I'm comfortable doing? Yes, I have, but they are an extreme minority of the total amount of the people that I have experienced doing this work day in and day out. And it's, when we're talking about the demand is so great that the people who would voluntarily enter into this and identify as sex workers and experience prostitution on their own terms, they're not going to meet that demand. And so that the supply isn't going to be there. And so the demand is going to exploit very vulnerable and marginalized communities, to include people of color and the LGBTQ populations, people that are going to be subject to exploitation. So this bill took a lot of work, but we're really excited about the future. We've only been in place since 2023. So now we're looking to try to, set an example for the rest of the country and serve as a model going forward.
Great. So we just have a few more minutes for the panel. So I have one last question that I hope a few of you can chime in on. So as Yasmin said earlier, the JVTA set a powerful federal precedent with respect to demand reduction as a form of trafficking prevention. Yet we still struggle to build a collective understanding, whether we're in Washington or New York or California, that the demand for prostitution fuels sex trafficking. And we cannot end sex trafficking without targeting this demand. So I wanted to ask our panelists today, what are some of the hurdles in getting people, the public and lawmakers, to see demand reduction as violence prevention, violence against women and girls, against the LGBTQ plus community, and against children?
You asked what the hurdles are, and I think the answers vary depending on state, neighborhoods, populations. I think culturally, one of the biggest hurdles is that we don't see anything wrong with sex buying. And I think that comes from many, many different ways. It could have passed down from your family conversations. It could be from the movies that we see, right? If we see Pretty Woman or Hustlers or things like that, we think it's glamorized, right? This notion of sex work is this idea that you can be empowered in prostitution. So with all of that circulating and with OnlyFans and with all of these other things, and of course it's going to be really hard as a culture to all unify on the notion that prostitution is inherently harmful. So I think culturally that's one of our biggest hurdles, in addition to what I said earlier about the excuses that we make for, these quote unquote lonely men that are just trying to, get whatever it is that they want because they paid for it. So I think if we want to change our culture, we need to have more conversations with survivors that are on the ground, not just those who identify as sex workers, but folks who can see it from both sides and who have exited. I think on the law side, on the lawmaker side, what I've noticed with a lot of the politicians and lawmakers that I've spoken to is that some of them are either not educated on the issue completely and have only heard maybe one or no sides of this issue. But a lot of them are fearful to take a stance. And Nate, you just mentioned this. The first time we tried to get the bill passed, they didn't want to be the first in the country to do it. When I go state by state and I talk to these different lawmakers, because taking a stance with this model would mean going against this culture that I just talked about, right? Or going against people who feel that prostitution is empowerment. They fear backlash. They fear like they're gonna be ousted. They feel like they're being a naysayer or a nun and they're not like being progressive. But the reality is that they're actually being very strong in that perspective. So I think what we need are strong lawmakers like I can never say her name fast, Lois Galgay, right? We need more lawmakers like that who are not afraid of backlash, who can understand the nuances and the complexities of the system of prostitution and sex trafficking and commercial exploitation. We need to have people that are not afraid of confrontation and that can back it up with all of the survivor voices like myself that stand there with them. I just think it takes a lawmaker making the first step and saying, I could care less what you think about it.
While listening to you, the angrier I was getting because we're fighting these things right now. People are laughing in the room because they know what happens when I get angry. So, but what makes me angry is that I'm thinking it's almost like how dare you sit in your office and you are afraid of hurting somebody's feelings while people are getting maimed and murdered and killed in the street, and that doesn't matter. Does it not matter because they're looked at as being the marginalized people that nobody really cares about? But who really matters is you hurting someone's feelings. And I feel so strongly about this because there's two bills that I have been working with in California. And when you see things happen, you're going like, really? Did that just happen? So one of them is we were working with SB 1414, and what it basically said is that it's a felony charge for soliciting a minor. And so it was supposed to be any minor under the age of 18. Well, we know that federal law says that if they're under the age of 18, they're automatically a victim of human trafficking. But California has kind of tailored it to look a little differently. That's why we have this fight, which is crazy to me. So 1414, we were there, and they did a hostile amendment with Shannon Grove that basically said that, okay, soliciting a minor for the purposes of commercial sex, we'll go with it if she's under the age of 16. So they cut out 16, 17-year-olds. Well, I was there that day, and it was, oh man, it was not a good look. And so I guess I couldn't believe it, and she was very upset with the fact that they just pulled this hostile amendment. So so it passed. Here we are again, and now we're working with AB 379 to get that terminology back in for 16 and 17-year-olds, and it ended up being taken out again, right? But then it got put back in with a 3-year difference because they were afraid of unintended consequences, where it might be someone, again, the excuses, where it might be someone who might be an older teenager, and they didn't want to see them go to state prison. Well, they're not going to state prison anyway, because juveniles don't go to state prison. So, all that to say that that's a bill that we're working on. They put the 16, 17-year-olds with a 3-year difference, and it passed the Assembly. So now we're going to see what's going to happen when it goes to the Senate. So it's a constant fight, but what I don't understand is, why is it a constant fight? It just does not make sense to me. The only thing I can think of is that if we talk about that over 50% of victims of human trafficking are African-American girls. And so we don't want to add in 16, 17-year-olds. Is it because the adultification theory is in play? Because after all, they're not children. Well, they are, because guess what? They're under the age of 18 and they can't consent to sex. So it just baffles me that we continue to have these conversations. And again, it goes back to education of those that are making these policy decisions. It goes back to the education of the public, that they really need to understand what is going on and to be able to back legislation that is going to be able to help those that are in the street and are affected by this. And it's just so important that we put this out there and we hold legislators accountable when they don't want to hurt people's feelings.
Yes. And I just quickly have to jump in on that real quick, because that's what, Dr. Powell was referring to when she said we don't have the laws to hold child sex buyers accountable. It was a misdemeanor up until these laws in the last couple of years to buy minors for sex in California. It is a misdemeanor to buy children for sex in New York. And, we're now looking to make this a national campaign because apparently that's a thing. What's interesting is that in California, it's a felony to traffic minors under the age of 18, but it's a misdemeanor to purchase minors under the age of 18. And so, yes, this was, I testified on this legislation a couple of weeks ago, and right before the hearing, the 16 and 17-year-old language was stripped. And so to learn more about this adultification bias concept, please take a look at our fact sheet outside on this issue of African-American girls and child sex trafficking, because it absolutely is a form of bias that denies Black girls their status as children and child victims, but also their status as victims of crime. And to your question, Nora, one of the other, I think, obstacles that we have is this constant argument that, sex trafficking and prostitution are being conflated. And, so they're being conflated, so we just need to ignore these arguments altogether. People are talking about demand and they're conflating prostitution and sex trafficking. They're totally different things. And, again, as an attorney, it's not so much that they are being conflated, it's that these are two concepts and issues that are inextricably linked. We recognize that prostitution and sex trafficking are legally distinct concepts. But as the survivors that are here today will tell you, practically speaking, the lines between these two issues are incredibly blurry in real life. And having worked with hundreds of sex trade survivors at this point, survivors will tell you that they transcend the lines between these two legal definitions many times in the course of their experiences in the commercial sex trade. And they can transcend that line in the course of a week, in months, and certainly years in the sex trade. So we are not conflating them. They cannot exist without the other. The ways in which these two concepts are linked is that many, if not most, sex trafficking, sex trade survivors first entered the industry when they were children. And so legally, they were child sex trafficking victims. What happens when these children turn 18? Do they become, automatically become consenting sex workers? Or do they still have many of the same vulnerabilities that led them to become involved in the sex trade to begin with? One of the other ways that these two issues are linked is that sex buyers cannot meaningfully discern whether the people they're soliciting are consenting or not, are trafficked or not. And frankly, they do not care. As our report makes clear, they talk about and are excited when they think they've scored a young one. One of them is like, oh, she said 24, but I think she might only be 18. She had braces. They're excited when they think that there's the younger the better. As a very prominent survivor has said, Rachel Morin, I've answered enough phones and enough brothels to tell you that the number one question you get is, what's the youngest girl you've got? This is a thing that continuously happens. Survivor here from DC said, buyers don't care. They don't check our IDs. I can riddle off a million stories from survivors. We had another survivor from LA County who was 16 years old. She said for 6 months, she made up her mind that she was going to tell every sex buyer she was with that she was trafficked. She needed help. And for 6 months, not a single buyer helped her. And the main reason was because they had already paid. Wow. So this is what we're dealing with here. And the other ways that these issues are connected is that the policy decisions that impact one of these issues inevitably impact the other because they're happening in the same ecosystem. It's not as if there's a market for sex buyers to be soliciting trafficking victims over here and a market for sex buyers to be soliciting consenting adult sex workers over here. It's all happening in the same place. So this argument that, oh, they're just conflating, sex work and prostitution and sex trafficking, that there's no conflation happening here. These issues have to be talked about together because the solicitation is not of sex trafficking victims. The solicitation that is happening of sex buyers is of commercial sex. And that is what we have to tackle. When we talk about demand reduction, we're talking about reducing the demand for commercial sex. And I think that has been one of our biggest obstacles. People think that they can throw that out and shut down the conversation, but that is why we can't shut down the conversation. It has to be discussed broadly like that.
Quick model. Just in practice in the way in Maine, just that maybe a very important thing is that Maine used to have first an affirmative defense and then a complete defense. If you were a victim of trafficking, you couldn't be convicted for selling sex. But as was pointed out, that's kind of like there's lots of people that I've encountered that are just in between traffickers, or as I've heard it said, that poverty was their pimp. But the buyers, when I do the stings, they're not calling in and saying, are you being trafficked? It's, are you a cop? So just that trying to draw the false distinction between trafficking victims and people experiencing prostitution. It's all the Venn diagram is a circle in terms of exploitation. And so now that we've adopted the equality model, the women or the people who are experiencing prostitution, they're a victim in all instances. All of our investigations are treated as a victim. and we try to make it so that our investigations are victim-centered and trauma-informed, and that we bring in advocates early and often as part of our investigation. So we're not going in with a police officer in uniform reading them the Miranda rights. We're going in with an advocate saying, how can we help? We think this is happening. Will you talk to us?
Okay, we'll take a pause there. We are going to have time for some questions, but before we move on to that, I'd like to invite Cristian Eduardo, a survivor leader who was featured in our report, and we're honored to have here with us today. He'd like to share a few remarks. Cristian Eduardo is a survivor of labor and sex trafficking, and he is a fierce advocate for immigrants, people living with HIV, the LGBTQ plus community, and sex trade survivors.
Hi everyone. I just want to start by saying thank you so much. I think that we have heard a lot of the realities. Sex buying is really a crime that is affecting our communities, that is affecting people like me. 10 years ago, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act was signed into law. Very pivotal moment for the anti-trafficking movement, really giving clearly federal guidance about the importance of demand reduction strategies. And the interesting part is that this 10th anniversary is my 10th anniversary of being here in the United States. Not long ago, I was homeless, no friends, no family, no knowing what happened to me, not having the language, not knowing, thinking that it was my decision, thinking that it was my choice, thinking that it was my consent. The reality is that not only the traffickers, but also the sex buyers gave me a scar. They taught me how to disassociate, they taught me how to disconnect, they taught me that the only way to survive it was to give access to my body. And that is gonna haunt me until the last day of my life. While still those same sex buyers, those people that were accessing my body for their pleasure, are just happily walking all around, doing the same to other people. This is why it's so, so important. As some of my coworkers were saying, there are no good or sex buyers. Sex buyers is really and deeply affecting every single one of you. We all know the sex buyers. They are in our communities. They are a lot of times their fathers, grandfathers, cousins, aunts, judges, firefighters, police. That is a huge problem with demand. We don't want to face that those that say that they were going to protect us are the ones who are raping and abusing us. This is the reality of demand. There was a time not long ago when the way of my trauma and the horrific experience of being trafficked led me to consider giving up, just stop living. And that's the reality of a lot of survivors, because we don't have value in society. We think that the only value that we have is when people access our body. But after all this pain, after all this consuming darkness, today I stand before you, not as a victim defined by my trauma and what the buyers and my traffickers did to me, but as a survivor, empowered, and resolute. I am here because the people who came before me, who are even in this room, who have fought tirelessly for legislation like the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, of the Survivor and the Equality Model in Maine, they were here before me, and they were here fighting, not knowing that I was being trafficked out there. They were already fighting for me. And this is how justice looks like. It's not only about accountability, but really empowering survivors and creating paths where we can understand and really create our own path based on our dreams, knowing that it's not our responsibility to sell our bodies to thrive in this society. With the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking was created. And today I'm standing in front of you because I'm an appointed member of this, giving federal guidance on how to combat human trafficking. So 10 years ago, because of trafficking, I didn't know what to do with my life. I thought that the solution was ending my life. And today I'm giving federal guidance on how to combat human trafficking. This is really the justice that we want to see. This is why it's so important to celebrate, to commemorate, and to recognize all the sacrifice, all the fights that every single advocate is doing. Because even if you don't know it, you're fighting for all the survivors that are there. You're fighting when we are being raped. You're fighting when we're bleeding. You're fighting when we are just crying in the darkness alone. So thank you so much for everyone that has fought for all of us, for everyone who is continuing fighting, for all senator, congressperson that are fighting for us, that are still, regardless if they are gonna hurt some feelings, regardless if someone is gonna talk about them. Trust me, you are saving our lives. Thank you so much, and let's continue fighting and addressing human trafficking in the way that we can keep accountability on sex buyers.
Okay, now we have some time for a few questions. Anybody? Back?
To the gentleman from Maine, did that law pass in June 2023? I think about a year, about 2 years.
Yeah, about the fall, yeah.
What analysis have you done to deal with the other collateral crimes that have occurred? And I'm raising this because I know in Rhode Island, there was a loophole that basically decriminalized prostitution. Of course, prostitution is legal in most counties in the state of Nevada. So I'm curious what, if any, collateral consequences Maine has been impacted as a result of this law.
Sure, thanks. No, we were very conscientious of that, and especially the lesson learned in Rhode Island. So the way Maine's legal framework was set up is that we had actually had a modernized criminal code as of the 1970s, kind of an adoption of the model penal code. So for us to implement the equality model, we had two discrete laws. One was for sex selling, one was for sex buying. We repealed the sex selling statute, left intact the sex buying statute. So in all instances, sex buying is still criminalized. So it's why we're referring to it as partial decriminalization. And we also made efforts to make sure that there would be protections for people being charged for sex trafficking if it's they themselves who are actually the ones being trafficked, as well as making sure that we weren't going to be having issues with like conspiracies or things like that, criminal investigations, and then focusing on protecting the people who are experiencing prostitution. But in terms of collateral consequences, we haven't seen any issues with. That was one of the concerns that was raised early on in our legislative progress was the concern that would lead to an increase in trafficking, that traffickers would use it as telling the people who are being trafficked, don't worry, you're not going to be arrested. But we just haven't seen that actually come to fruition in Maine. Being arrested wasn't the thing that was, holding people back. So it's something that really we haven't seen play out, kind of unfounded concern from my experience.
And we've been doing a series of implementation trainings on the law. So there's been a series of law enforcement and prosecutors training on the importance of making sure that, law enforcement and judges and prosecutors are aware of the technicalities of the law and still enforcing, demand reduction efforts. But if you were able to grab a copy of our Buyers Unmasked report, you'll see the differences in the different legal models addressing the sex trade and the differences between the Maine model, for example, and Rhode Island's model. We do an in-depth case study on Rhode Island as compared to Maine, for example, and some of the other jurisdictions. But Rhode Island, for example, was an example of the decriminalization, a full decriminalization that we looked at, and one of the models that we, don't recommend. Because the different key differences being that in addition to repealing the crime of selling sex, Rhode Island also repealed the crimes of purchasing and, for lack of a better term, pimping or procurement or promoting prostitution.
One thing is the Zoom here, people are asking if it's possible for the panelists to repeat questions for the Zoom.
The question from the audience was, has Maine noticed any increases in collateral crime as a result of their survivor model partial decriminalization law?
Yes.
I have so many things to say, but none of them are really. I want to know, each and every one of you, if you can say one thing, if we're out on Zoom, that people hear, what's one thing each one of us can do or you want us to do? Because I so hear your voice, right? And to have the world fully understand the impact of purchasing a human is what's one thing you want us to do? What's an action we can take wherever we are? What do you need us to do to like move not only legislation forward, but to increase awareness, to have buyers learn more about, how to stop this, whatever thing it is that has them doing this? Like, I want to know an action from each of you because we got to go out and make a difference, and you're the experts.
So the question is, just to repeat it for Zoom, is what is one thing that each of us would say that everyone in this room can do to make a difference in this fight to end commercial sexual exploitation?
Hold politicians accountable. And who holds politicians accountable is their constituents.
So how would we do that? Bring in action.
We need to hold them accountable by making phone calls. You need to call your local legislators, have meetings with them, know that you exist, petitions, letters. It could even be a simple phone call that I support, let's say AB 379 or whatever it may be. So those are the things that can happen.
Okay, sorry, I thought Yasmin was going to speak. I agree. I think my overall action for lawmakers is to adopt this partial decriminalization model. I think I just need folks to step up and sponsor or co-sponsor bills and hold more of these conversations. And then on the ground, I would absolutely say investing in survivor and survivor-led organizations. A lot of times there are a lot of survivors that think like me, that think like Christian Eduardo, that understand this policy and this model and its actual harms implications. We don't always have the platforms to talk about it freely and as raw as some of those quotes were. So investing in survivors and signing these things into law.
I would say promoting some of these promising practices that we highlighted here and that are highlighted in the report, like, those buyer accountability legislation that the survivors we've worked with have really championed across the country. For example, legislation that attaches either $1,000 fine for sex buying in Illinois, for example. It's a sliding scale fine that's proportional to income to make it more equitable, so that more affluent sex buyers are paying a higher fine than, someone who's low income, to make it equitable and to make it a real deterrent. And then those fines go into Survivor Services Fund to help finance services and support. And at a time where, many grants are being, revoked or stalled, and, state budgets are scarce, this is a really innovative and important, survivor-centered way of getting funding. We've seen, JVTA did something very similar at a time where we weren't, seeing a lot of appropriations for domestic victims of trafficking. And we found a lot of success with this. And I think implementing these buyer accountability programs that share many of the elements of Peter's program that we highlighted in the report as part of a broader prevention curriculum and conversation in our communities. Because, we talk a lot about in our movements, and Rights for Girls sits at the intersection of multiple different issues, but we talk a lot about, community accountability. But right now, when it comes to these issues, the community is largely complicit. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to have these conversations. Right now we're seeing what's happening with the Diddy trial and the way the public is vilifying, Cassie and Ventura. And I think it's just really important for all of us to be having these conversations. One of the other things that, when Dr. Powell talked about AB 379, one of the lead senators who was opposing you know, that addition of the language, making it a felony to buy 16 and 17-year-olds, you know, tweeted publicly over the weekend saying, you know, can you believe these advocates want to send kids to state prison for giving $20 to their classmate to fool around? You know, that's what and we were like, respectfully, that's not what's driving the market for 16 and 17-year-old girls. Yeah. But also, why are we normalizing transactional sex amongst high school classmates or grade school classmates? Like, that is a problem. And, you know, it's a problem for all kids in school. And this is the type of behavior that, as Peter talked about, is on the spectrum of gender-based violence. And what we're talking about today is, you know, the razor's edge of sexual violence. But, you know, all of this needs to be talked about on a continuum of gender-based violence. And transactional sex being, you know, a very harmful form.
Yeah, and kind of dovetailing off of that, I want to say a couple more things about prevention and specifically around working with adolescent, middle school, high school age boys and men. I get calls from folks who are doing anti-trafficking work around the country, and this is one of the problems with framing things as anti-trafficking and trafficking being a third-party exploiter, where people will call and say, you know, we're doing a trafficking prevention program. And when I find out what they're doing, they're telling young people how not to be trafficked. Now, I came into this work in the late 80s through sexual assault prevention. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, back in the 80s, the earlier 80s, sexual assault prevention was about going around to schools and giving out whistles, right? Here, if you get raped, blow this whistle, girls. Like, and then we came to our senses and recognized that there were a lot of other folks in the room who had more say about whether rape was going to happen. That was those the ones that were initiating unwanted sexual activity. You know, predominantly the boys in the room. Right? And so we need to not make the same mistakes. We need to integrate trafficking prevention, this commercial sexual exploitation prevention, into existing curricula that are working on intimate partner violence prevention, sexual harassment prevention, sexual assault prevention, bullying prevention. Like, these problems all have the same root, right? And that root, again, and when we're talking about this, is that transactional sex, and not just the transaction in prostitution, right? The transactional entitlement could be in marriage, where men feel they're entitled to sex in marriage. Men feel we're entitled to sex if we've dated 3 times, if we've bought dinner, if we've had sex consensually with someone before. And so my other ask, because I'm in two of my asks. The first would be better prevention programming, and the second one would be for boys and men to have the courage to call one another into account.
Yes.
You know, and I'm saying that not in a legal or criminal justice sense, but in a social justice sense, and in the sense of love. To call the other in with love, and to model the type of behavior that we want to see from others. So that's my ask.
Sure. Mine is basically just to show up and speak up, because the people who are experiencing a lot of the harms you're hearing about are not being platformed, and the people who are the people who have that, you know, entitlement, and the buyers who are able to control the narratives and say things to make themselves feel better about why they buy sex. And I guess also, Maine is very fortunate that we had a champion in the legislature that would really push for this. So I think, you know, there's other people here who could be that champion, hopefully, if you show up and speak to folks, but also being one of the few men in the room at all times whenever we're talking about prostitution and sex trafficking gets old.
Yes.
You know, I was joking with Peter the other day. It's like, have you guys met? I was like, yeah, we're the 2 guys in the room.
Yes.
So it needs to, my ask would be to involve men in this. Do not allow this to be, you know, a women's issue. Try to bring folks in, especially men, because they account for most of the buyers.
And now we are lucky enough to have Senator Cornyn here. He is the chief sponsor and champion behind the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act,
the historic federal law emphasizing the importance of apprehending sex buyers and confronting demand as a key form of trafficking prevention. Please welcome Senator Holmes.
I was interrupting something. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the nation's capital. It's great to see all of you. Thanks to Yasmin and Right for Girls for organizing today's briefing, and I'm sure it's been a very informative panel. Human trafficking is modern day slavery, as we all know. Violates human dignity, respect, and freedom. And I'm proud to work with this organization, many of you in the room, some in the back of the room, for many years on legislation trying to do what we can to protect this vulnerable population. Back when I was Attorney General of Texas, I figured that it was ultimately the government's job. If family, if neighbors, if other people couldn't be depended upon to do so, it was the government's job to step in sometimes and to protect the most vulnerable. And so certainly this population qualifies. This year marks a decade since this legislation, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, became law, thanks to the support of Right for Girls and more than 200 other groups. For more than 10 years, since I authored the law, the goal was to protect our most vulnerable, as I said, and to target predators. And the impact of the bill can be felt in many ways, although it's often difficult to quantify. That said, I wouldn't be a politician if I didn't at least try. In the JVTA, we created the Domestic Trafficking Victims Fund to provide victims with greater support services. As I traveled the state and talked to various support organizations, that was the one thing that always stood out. We need more access to resources to provide enhanced services. So what we did is we borrowed from my experience as Attorney General, where I was responsible for administering the Crime Victims Compensation Fund in the state of Texas, to create a fund for survivors through the Department of Justice. And so far, to date, over 10 years period of time, it's accumulated more than $100 million in deposits that have been available to survivors. Last year alone, this fund raised $9 million. This fund is important for obvious reasons, but I'll just state the obvious: to provide resources for victim services, shelter, counseling, and to begin the healing after unimaginable horrors. While the money is something that I'm happy to celebrate with you, I think I speak for all of us that I say the joy of helping a family become whole again is priceless. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to reuniting missing children with their parents. Thanks to the heroic effort of the U.S. Marshals Service and our law enforcement officers, I'm proud to say that nearly 4,000 missing children have been reunited with their families since this bill became law. And in 2024 alone, more than 700 children were found. It's not easy for Congress to come together, you might have noticed, and to do things on a bipartisan basis, or in this case, I'd prefer to say nonpartisan basis. But there is no greater reward or motivation than reflecting on the fruits of your labor. And I'm talking about all of us collectively who were part of this, and seeing the impact just one law can have on so many lives. And of course, none of this would have been possible without many of you here in the room today. There's no single formula, obviously. These are complex situations. How to help survivors, how to stop the violence, but Right for Girls has long been the gold standard in empowering women, educating communities, and restoring lives. As the dad of 2 daughters, let me just thank all of you for your many years of partnership, and I look forward to many more. Together, we can end this crisis and show that hope, there is hope amidst the darkness. Thank you for having me come back. Shall get back to work.
Thank you all so much for joining us. We have the room for a little bit longer, so the panelists will be here to stay and mingle up. Can you please give our moderator, Nora Hennick, a huge round? Long distance to be with us today. On Zoom, we're very, very grateful. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for being here. We're really grateful. Thank you.